The first is sex as story. The second one is sex as good, which of course is in our title. The third one is sex as mission, and I'll explain what I mean by these in a few minutes. And the final one is sex as symbol. That I think looking at sex from these lenses, we can get to the heart of what Christianity perceives human sexuality to be about, what it's for. So, sex as story. Alistair MacIntyre, he's a well-known philosopher at Notre Dame, has argued in his book, After Virtue, that three features are increasingly characteristic of modern moral debates in our society when people disagree with each other strongly about anything. He says, here are the three characteristics that increasingly characterize the way we talk to each other, argue with each other when we disagree. He says the first is this, that most of our conversation is used to explicitly express only disagreement, not shared common ground we might have with each other, or constructive ways we might have of moving forward. And of course in our political season, and you just look at the news every day, so much of our rhetoric is just, you're wrong, I'm right, no, you're wrong, I'm right, and it never gets past that. It just becomes this kind of festival of disagreement, where it never is about anything but that. And of course, following from that, second, MacIntyre argues that the tone of our discussions are increasingly shrill, hostile, and defensive, which makes sense when all you're doing is disagreeing with each other. And third, and maybe most depressingly of all, he says our moral disagreements, whether about sex or anything else, appear to be interminable. And what he means by that is it doesn't seem like there's a way to ever reach agreement. That it seems like we are caught in an endless cycle of just assertion and counter-assertion and kind of the will to power with no way to find common ground. And here's why MacIntyre believes that at least the way we do moral debate today, we don't really have a way forward. Here's what he says in After Virtue. The most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used only to express disagreements, as I mentioned. And the most striking feature of these debates, in which these disagreements are expressed, is their interminable, endless character. I do not mean by this just that such debates go on and on and on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture, and certainly that's true about sex. We see the conceptual incommensurability of the rival arguments in each moral debate in our culture. Every one of the arguments is logically valid on its own terms and can be easily expanded so as to be made so. The conclusions do indeed follow from each group's premises. But the rival premises are such that we possess no rational way of weighing the claims of one group as against another. For each premise employs some quite different normative or evaluative concept from the others, so that the claims made by one are quite different than the claims made by another, and there's no way to kind of bridge the gap. From our rival conclusions, we can always argue back to our rival premises or assumptions, but when we do arrive at our premises, argument ceases, and the simple invocation of one premise against another becomes a matter of pure assertion. So, the question is, obviously Christianity historically teaches things about sex that are widely dissented from in our society, even widely disliked. The question is, in the face of these disagreements, not only how can productive conversation and dialogue happen, but what's at the root of the disagreements? And one of the things I want to suggest tonight is that, and let me just point something out that I would imagine you're all familiar with. If you've ever sat down and had an extended, real conversation with someone who disagrees passionately and radically with what you think about sex, I think one of the things you find early on is that your disagreements are not really about sex. They're about much deeper assumptions of what human beings are for, why we're here, what makes for human flourishing, what criteria you use to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil. And so, disagreements about sex are rarely, in the final showing, actual disagreements about sex, but as MacIntyre points out, they're actually about the premises, the base foundational assumptions we have about life. And one way that I think that we should conceive of this, think about this, is to think not so much about the rules, the surface rules or convictions or moral sentiments we have about sex, but so to speak, the stories underneath sex that we live by and that we interpret our existence through. MacIntyre goes on in After Virtue to say this later on, and I think this is an incredibly insightful statement. He says, human beings in their actions and their practices, and not only in their fictional stories, are essentially storytelling animals. I can only answer the question, what am I to do? Ethics? If I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part of? And so the question about sex is ultimately a deeper question, which is, what is the story of human existence? What are we here for? What is our life about? And this isn't any novel explanation or a cheap attempt to kind of sidestep the real issues. It's a reminder that the issues are not being addressed at all when we make a beeline straight towards argument over the surface rules or convictions without first wrestling over the more fundamental issues of the purpose of human existence. Christian Smith, a well-known sociologist, has pointed this out recently in his book, Moral Believing Animals, Human Personhood and Culture. In it, he points out this fallacy that we often have, which is that kind of ancient humans were primitive and archaic, and we're kind of enlightened and kind of fundamentally different from them. And he points out the one thing that modern human beings share deeply in common with ancient human beings is that we understand our existence through stories. And so here's what Smith says. For all of our science, all of our rationality, all of our technology, we modern people are no less the makers, tellers, and believers of narrative interpretations of existence, history, and purpose than were our ancestors at any other time in human history. But more than that, we not only continue to be animals who make up stories, but also animals who are made by our stories. We tell and retell narratives that themselves come fundamentally to constitute and direct our lives. We, every bit as much as the most primitive or traditional of our ancestors, are animals who most fundamentally understand what reality is, who we are, and how we ought to live by locating ourselves within the larger narratives and meta-narratives that we hear and tell around us and that constitute what is for us significant and real. I think that's already pretty insightful, but Smith goes on to argue, and I'm going to read this in a second, the connection between that, the storytelling nature of human beings, and how we arrive at our moral sense of what's right and wrong, beautiful and ugly in the world. He goes on and he says, the sacred ideals or moral convictions that define social orders and cultures do not float freely around in the sky of ideas, like arbitrary clumps of ideas and beliefs that just somehow happen to get invested with religious qualities later on. Rather, the sacred that is at the heart of any civilization is always embedded in and arising from its collective stories. It is the story that constructs the ideal. And then he goes on and he argues with this statement that for all human beings, the normative is organized by the narrative. That what you think holds morally is always flowing out of deeper questions of purpose, of story, of what we're here for. Let me just give one brief example. Part of where I'm going to go later on is pointing out how I think this is true for Christianity. Let me just point out one example of this that I think is pretty obvious, but sometimes because we're so saturated in kind of the leftovers, the after effects of the Christian story on our society, even though by and large our society doesn't live by that story anymore, that we often miss this connection. Almost all historical scholars agree that historically there's a strong connection between the belief in monotheism and the practice of monogamy. Think about the connections. Monotheism believes this: there is only one God, and you need to give all that you are to Him all the time. Think about what monogamy is. For human beings, there should only be one sexual partner that you give all of yourself to unreservedly, all the time, permanently. There's a connection between the story, that there's only one God, and the moral kind of normative statement, which is faithful monogamy, which of course is the Christian teaching from the beginning. And without the story, not only does the ethical sentiment not make any sense, it can't be sustained, and it never even would have arose without the story. And so the story of sex is underneath all the disagreements about sex, I think, in our culture. So the question is then, what is the Christian story of sex? What characterizes the Christian story of sex? And here's the last 2 points. Sex is good, sex is missional, and sex is symbolic.